Thanks for tuning in. This talk addresses two seemingly very simple questions about Holocene climate change over Greenland and surrounding seas. One, when was peak warmth of the Holocene? Was it in the early or middle Holocene? And two, how warm did it get? There hasn't been a clear consensus answer to either question. And the climate drivers involved are really quite complex. So in the early Holocene, we have a Greenland ice sheet that's probably a bit larger than today on average. Most of northeastern Canada is covered by inherited Pleistocene ice, and all of that ice is rapidly wasting away, contributing large volumes of fresh meltwater to the surrounding seas. Meanwhile, this area is experiencing its Holocene peak in summer insolation, really setting up contrasting climate forcings. And terrestrial species are racing to colonize essentially blank slate landscapes across this map area. In the middle Holocene, in contrast, ice sheets looked a lot like modern, maybe a bit smaller. There was still a positive anomaly in summer insolation, but it was weaker. And terrestrial ecosystems and landscapes were relatively stable and well established. So which of these time periods was warmer? I'm going to share answers to those questions that come from a review paper that's in press now, written with paleoceanographer Anne de Vernal and glaciochemist Eric Osterberg. We compiled about 75 records from Greenland and its surrounding seas that are at least 7,000 years long and that reconstruct sea surface temperatures, sea surface salinity and sea ice, air temperatures with a focus on quantitative summer temperature reconstructions, and finally, continuous reconstructions of mountain glacier and ice cap fluctuations from glacier-fed lakes. The big picture punchline from Anne's compilation of sea surface reconstructions is that sites far offshore and strongly influenced by the North Atlantic Current were warmest. In fact, they were very warm during the early Holocene. The story closer to land, though, in bays, straits, and fjords is very different. Yes, summer sea surface temperatures did peak in the early Holocene near shore, but meltwater from the decaying ice sheet created a very complicated pattern of sea surface conditions near shore. Here's an example. In all of the time series I'll show here, time will progress from left to right towards the present, and the early Holocene is highlighted in yellow. Dynasys in this core from the Labrador Sea record peak summer sea surface temperatures in the early Holocene. Yes, but low salinity in the early Holocene from meltwater caused intensified stratification in the water column. That gave the early Holocene the coldest winter sea surface temperatures of the Holocene, and more sea ice than the middle or late Holocene. That's a pattern seen at numerous sites around Greenland's margins. This complexity makes it kind of hard to answer the question, when was the Holocene Thermal Maximum in the marine realm? But if we ask more specifically, when were summers warmest, the answer is more clearly in the early Holocene. Importantly, the early Holocene was also a time of enhanced seasonality in sea surface conditions. Now we'll turn our attention to summer temperatures over land. We compiled quantitative reconstructions of summer air temperatures, which come from pollen, insect assemblages, namely midges, and in one case, isotopes of precipitation. And two, evidence from lakes for periods when upstream ice caps and mountain glaciers, not the ice sheet itself, but smaller independent glaciers, were smaller than they are today. We view this as robust evidence of warmer than present conditions. And finally, we compare those types of evidence with the ice cores that were least affected by surface elevation changes in the Holocene. In other words, the ice cores from Summit and the marginal ice caps Agassiz and Renland. Fortunately, in two parts of Greenland, we can actually compare ice cores directly with nearby lake records. So we can assume the same broad-scale regional climate trends affected all the sites in Northwest Greenland and East Greenland, which I'll show next. And therefore, we can look to see how different proxies perform when they're compared with one another. We'll start in the Northwest with the Agassiz ice cores from Ellesmere. Both melt and delta O18 at Agassiz indicate much warmer temperatures in the early Holocene, which is shaded yellow, than in the middle Holocene. One local ice cap in northwest Greenland is known to have been smaller than it is today for most of the Holocene, starting just before 10,000 years ago, the time shown with that orange band. That reinforces that summer temperatures in this region exceeded today's by 10 Ka. In the green, extraliminal boreal beetles and fish also show up in lakes in northwest Greenland around 9,000 years ago, although they're not consistently preserved in this type of record, so their absence in most of the record doesn't tell us much. Their presence clearly tells us climate was decidedly warmer than today's during the period with that green bar. Now for the quantitative lake proxies. How do they perform? Midges suggest very warm peak temperatures in the early Holocene, then declining temperatures through the middle to late Holocene. The pollen transfer function used here, the two dashed lines, suggests something very different. Pollen-inferred temperatures didn't rise above modern even until well into the middle Holocene. That contrasts with the other evidence, including boreal animals found in the same lake cores as the pollen, the ice cores, and the midges. We think this pattern suggests that pollen, at least the species of plants that are important in the transfer function used here, is not accurately reflecting summer temperatures here in the early Holocene. The major divergence of pollen from the other indicators is pretty specific to the early Holocene. It could reflect maybe long lags in post-glacial plant colonization or possibly no analog climate. The take-homes from the Northwest are strong early Holocene peak warmth, and that the pollen transfer function used here is failing to register that early Holocene warmth. Now let's compare that with East Greenland around Scoresby Sun, the other region in Greenland where we have a nice diverse set of records on land. Rhineland ice core delta 018 at the bottom, smaller than modern extensive local ice caps, which you see as orange bars, and midges, the solid red line in the top panel, all register warmer than modern conditions starting around 10,000 years ago. Midges and the ice core indicate the warmest temperatures of the Holocene happened in the early Holocene. Pollen in the dashed line to the top panel doesn't really extend into the early Holocene for comparison, unfortunately, but the oldest pollen data points at the early to mid Holocene transition are colder than modern, and Bromgårdsö pollen registers peak warmth after about 7,000 years ago. So again, like in the Northwest, in the East here we see multi-proxy evidence for strong early Holocene peak warmth, and pollen may be failing to capture that. In the West, near Ilulissat and Disco, ice caps were smaller than today in the early Holocene, but no quantitative temperature reconstructions cover the early Holocene, so it's unclear when peak warmth occurred. In the South, the types of evidence we've compiled suggest temperatures were not warmer than present until the middle Holocene. So a very different pattern than the other areas I've discussed. Mountain glaciers and one pollen study register peak warmth here in the middle Holocene. But overall, there's not a clear consensus from the available data. And I speculate that maybe the overall magnitude of Holocene climate change in this part of Greenland was small compared with areas further north. So we've seen data from the marginal ice caps, Rhineland and Agassiz, but what do the summit ice cores tell us about summer temperatures in the center of Greenland through the Holocene? There's not been any one very clear answer on this. In fact, it's still debated even whether peak Holocene temperatures occurred at summit in the early or the middle Holocene. Getting at summer here is tricky because the key proxies are annually integrated. They're not summer specific. It's also worth mentioning, and I'll come back to this in a bit, that these records are typically not elevation corrected. As one way to deal with seasonality in the summit ice core records, Christoph Wiesert has modeled seasonal temperatures using a combination of ice core-based temperature reconstructions and seasonal and spatial patterns and temperatures taken from CCSM3 in the TRACE simulations. That method yields a summer temperature peak at summit starting in the early Holocene that's quite warm, 2.5 to 3.75 degrees warmer than today. Like most, that estimate is not elevation corrected. That's because changes in ice sheet surface elevation are poorly known before 8,000 years ago, but we probably do know the direction of the difference in the early Holocene. The ice sheet surface at summit was higher than today, which muted evidence for regional warmth in the ice core record. In our paper, Eric provides a rough estimate of the effect, and he estimates it's about a degree. When you add that rough elevation correction to the summer temperatures modeled by Buizert, you get peak summer temperatures at summit 10 to 7,000 years ago of at least 3.5 degrees warmer than the mid-20th century. That's a much warmer early Holocene at summit than is often assumed. So final take-homes across ice cores, lake cores, and marine cores. Much of Greenland experienced very warm peak temperatures in the early Holocene, including sites far offshore. South Greenland may have been an exception to that pattern. The early Holocene was a time of extremes in many things: seasonality, stratification, and nearshore environments, spatial contrast. You had Pleistocene-like ice sheets sitting next door to very warm summer temperatures on land, for example. The Middle Holocene, instead, was a period of weaker warmth, but more consistent warmth across seasons and almost everywhere, evident in almost every system we have probed as a community. Looking towards the future, we should take note of the big effects of ice sheet meltwater in the early Holocene and the large amplitude of early Holocene warming in many parts of Greenland, which might reflect strong positive feedbacks. Thanks for your interest.